Okay, everybody, are we all sitting comfortably? Then we begin. Only people of a certain age get that. But I say you're all very welcome here this evening. I'm John Barry, for those of you who don't know, and you're very welcome on behalf of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action. This is one in a series of programmes that we have in terms of workshops and visiting speakers. So I'm delighted that we have here with us tonight Emma River Roberts, who is an eco-socialist activist, a founder of the Working Class Climate Alliance, founded last year in response to the domination of the professional climate and environmental movement by essentially mid-class people. And part of course, what Emma's going to be talking about tonight is how we don't often hear accents of a working class origin often in the climate and ecological space. And why is that? She's also an affiliate member of the Post-Growth Institute, and she tells me she's fueled by coffee and rage at the injustices of our current economic system. So can I ask you all to give her a warm Belfast welcome? So thank you.
Can you hear me all right at the back? Perfect. Well, thank you. Yeah, it's my first time in Belfast, so what better reason? So this talk draws on a lot of my experiences within the degrowth movement over the last few years, as well as a lot of conversations with other people about class and degrowth, about how they feel about it in their own personal experiences. So I do draw upon some of the existing degrowth literature, especially as the movement is very much shaped from within academia. But it is worth raising that the actual consideration that's ever been given to the working class in scholarship is marginal. In the majority of cases, people have to lean on Beverly Skegg's phrasing. They've abdicated their responsibility to give consideration to us. So my perspective is a global north one, because most of my work has been based in the UK. But there's absolutely parallels that can be drawn elsewhere. And it's impossible to say how many people actively support degrowth because of a lack of research. But there is a growing interest in it amongst people, and there are community groups out there who are actively trying to shape local policies into ones that fit the degrowth criteria, or at the very least, they're trying to get things to move in that direction. But despite their interest in it, there's still a lot of hesitation amongst these groups to actively involve themselves with the movement's middle class base. So we've got all these groups involved in some really great stuff, but they just remain apart from each other. And just to note as well, what I'm saying here today is more geared towards grassroots mobilisation. So with like working class communities and organisations and say like trade unions. And that's because degrowth has paid more attention to the working class and trade unions rather than the former. And there's a need to better understand the roles that communities can play as part of a much broader socio-ecological transformation. So I'll quickly run through what degrowth is, in case anyone's unfamiliar with it. It's a planned reduction of destructive and less necessary forms of production and consumption, so that's things like fossil fuels and SUVs. And doing so would reduce the energy and materials used by economies, allowing for a rapid transition to low carbon economies at a rate quick enough to stop further instances of ecological breakdown. But some countries do still need to grow. So where we would see this reduction in production and consumption from rich countries, poorer countries would continue to increase theirs for development purposes, and to ensure that respective populations can meet their needs, whilst still avoiding these less necessary and destructive sectors. But degrowthers also advocate for a social transformation of society, so one that's like centred around care and community rather than profitability and individualism. It's also mostly comprised of middle class people, and it's always struggled to attract working class support to any notable degree. Now, with the working class, for many reasons, the actual name degrowth is about as popular as food poisoning. They do use alternative words to describe it, but just for the purposes of this talk, for consistency and ease, I'm just going to call it degrowth. Now, according to the economist Timotei Parikh, if you care about class conflicts, workplace alienation, financial crises, corruption and democracy, you need to read about degrowth. But while it has much to say about workplace alienation, financial crises, corruption, and democracy, it has virtually nothing to say about class conflicts from the perspective of the working class themselves. And right now, the degrowth movement is engaged in an internal symbolic struggle, and that's because of oppositional conceptualizations about what the class struggle actually is. So this dominant approach, and this is the one that people tend to encounter in the books, the articles, and all of that. And it's that it's something fought out at the aggregate between the global population and ruling class. It's like a fight for equal access to material resources, a dignified life, a sustainable environment for future and present generations. And yes, this is all true. But the alienation of the working class doesn't just manifest at the aggregate. This isn't just an economic struggle. It's experienced every single day in society, and that's much of which has been imposed by a large proportion of the middle class themselves, who have come to self-internalise and reproduce the oppressive nature of the state through their historic and continued marginalisation, discrimination and exclusion of the working class. And this process is not novel, it's not confined to a localised area. It's a historically entrenched form of subjugation that's become a rite of passage for working class people throughout their lives. And this still continues to this day, including in mainstream environmentalism. And in turn, this has to varying degrees shaped how working class people navigate everyday life, how they view themselves, how they view and interact with others, who they choose to spend time with and who they don't. And the latter is absolutely critical to take on board here, considering that the movement is yet to acquire vocal working class support. And yeah, getting people to actually support degrowth as an economic concept is a challenge, to say the least. But what's also important to note is the preconceptions that working class people have of middle class environmentalists in general. And these preconceived beliefs that they'll be subjected to varying degrees of marginalisation is so heightened that they often retreat from engaging with them in their spaces. And that's as a way to hold on to their dignity and respect. And that's including in degrowth spaces as well. So as one organiser said to me, we've kissed a lot of frogs over the years, and we're just not willing to engage with people that we feel are going to tell us that we're ignorant again because we're not. I know this isn't the only factor preventing mobilisation, but it is one of the key ones that for whatever reason keeps getting overlooked. Now, the fact that degrowth actually has a dominant approach to class at all is actually very novel. So they've been going on for about, I guess, about half a century now. And for virtually all of that time, it was barely ever on the agenda. And I'd say it definitely was Matt Huber's book, Climate Change as Class War, that forced the conversation of class onto the table. And he stresses that the movement doesn't resonate with those struggling to get by. It's one mostly comprised of academically educated middle class people who advocate for lifestyle changes that are reflective of their own privileges. Things as, reducing somebody's own personal consumption levels, something that they call voluntary frugality, and that's where you willingly live as simply as possible. So what Huber actually calls the politics of less. But this just isn't relevant with those who are struggling to get by and have nothing that they can even cut back in the first place. Now, to give degrowth movement credit, they have started to dial down the extent to which they are talking about consumption since that book was actually published. But although Huber never touched upon these historic tensions between the classes at an everyday level, his general point about unrelatability between the classes is entirely valid. And it's something that the movement's often very hesitant to acknowledge. And as a way to prove degrowth's relevance to the working class, more often than not, they'll point to policy solutions. So universal basic income, accessible healthcare, housing, and so on. And according to Jason Hickel, degrowth means power for the working class. And in a podcast with Green New Deal Media, when he mentioned that last year, he just railed off a bunch of policies. Now, of course, all of these things are vital and it must be communicated. But with the working class, policy solutions are only going to get us so far. And it's the people who turn these abstract ideas into objective reality. And fundamentally, middle class environmentalists, the majority of the degrowth movement, are fundamentally unrelatable to the working class. And overall, when someone raises the issues of class tensions, and I've been here like a million times before, these are often dismissed as bad faith arguments, that it's divisive, that there's better things to critique degrowth on even, or they just don't say anything at all. And that's because degrowth pays so little attention to the working class as social beings, because we just had this silence on class throughout the movement's history. For the most part, their analyses are very uncritical and undeveloped. And it's a form of utopianised class politics that's completely devoid of context. And we need the context of how relations in everyday life have developed and been shaped, and what this means for community interaction. Because when we know that, we know not just what the problem is, but why. And when we know why, we can ascertain what the root cause or causes are that need to be rectified. So Locke defines classism as when people in lower social class levels are treated in ways that exclude, devalue, discount, or separate them. And this is our everyday experience. It's an everyday struggle for dignity and respect in mainstream society. And the contemporary foundations for this were laid in the late 20th century and through the spread of individualistic ideologies. So spearheaded by Margaret Thatcher, the notion that someone was wholly responsible for the conditions of their livelihoods enabled material comfort to be seen as the outcome of having the right priorities in life, which allowed the government to shirk responsibility for societal inequality onto the poor themselves and depoliticise its causes by problematising deprivation as the inevitable result of a personal moral failing. And in order for somebody to be able to lay claim to this status as the idealised, respectable citizen, this is demonstrated in part through material indicators, which show somebody independence from the state. So, for example, accumulating private property such as a house or a car. But in most cases, as we all know, favourable socioeconomic conditions such as being able to access decent standards of healthcare, housing and education are necessary preconditions to achieving this lifestyle. And this remains disproportionately out of reach for the working class owing to their systemic exclusion from these resources. So as a result, mainstream neoliberal conceptualisations of the respectable citizen came to be associated with middle classness. And this legitimised the classification of the working class as the objectionable other for not participating in this way of life. And this is something that many of the middle class did as well. They delegitimised their way of knowing the world at the delegitimisation of the working class people and theirs. But it's not just about material comfort or discomfort, it's also about culture and tastes. So ours are deemed to be illegitimate by many, often subject to ridicule. Programmes on the TV will depict us as feckless vagrants. If you live in a council estate, you're a scrounger. What we wear is a subject of derision. So this is actually a trend on social media called the chav trend. And that's where people turn themselves into caricatures of us. And we have to contend with our accents being singled out and mocked by others, which I still get. And this form of derision has become so entrenched for so long that it's become normalised. And instead of calling out classism, people find ways to justify it. So there was this absolute fucking dumpster fire of an article in the Evening Standard about the chav trend. And the author suggested that Gen Z's participation in this derision was simply them partaking in a fashionable past struggle. And I don't know how this is actually fashionable to the people that have lived through it. But this has cultivated a self-internalised shame carried by many working class people because of who they are and where they come from. Now, some people will actually lie about the part of town that they're from because of the stigma attached to where they live. Many will engage in what's often referred to as passing, and that's when you downplay your working classness as much as you can. You dress differently, normally quite plainly. You pronounce all your T's and put on your posh voice, because they know that as soon as they become recognisable as working class citizens, they become second class citizens. And in mainstream society at this point, to be visibly and vocally working class in certain spaces, rather than it being the natural outcome of how and where you're raised, is very often a defiance against this delegitimisation of our culture and tastes, our conduct by the state and the middle class. But it also leads to other forms of resistance. So in one light, we've got the active retreat of working class people from middle class led spaces as a form of self-preservation to hold on to your dignity and respect, to ensure that you're not exposed to another collective who are likely to marginalise you once again. But this resistance also emerges in the form of oppositional values. So the middle class are often painted as this bunch of selfish people, devoid of empathy for the situations of those less fortunate. And in some cases, they do actually engage in the same process of unfair stereotyping and misrepresentation by painting all middle-class people as dreadful individuals, devoid of empathy for those less fortunate and who've never had to actually struggle. And these same patterns of exclusion have found themselves replicated in mainstream environmentalism. So I think probably the most notorious example was when green consumption made its way onto the mainstream several years ago. And for many, this became a status pursuit. So they could accumulate these indicators, these material things to show that their purchasing choices reflected the right kind of moral dispositions. But despite the higher associated costs limiting the extent to which the working class could participate in it, in many cases preventing them from doing so entirely, they were and continue to be misrepresented as selfish and ignorant for purchasing the wrong types of things, such as fast fashion. The same applies in the case of their objections to the disruptive nature of protests, owing to fears of, for example, not being able to get to work and losing out on wages they can't afford to lose. And the pathologised not caring about the global south, of being ignorant about the disruption that ecological breakdown is going to bring with it if we don't get things under control. And rather than listening to their concerns, they're just being told that they're invalid. Which again, time and time again, is met with resistance by the working class, often in the form of oppositional values, by painting these people as overly virtuous, as virtue signallers as well. And what's highly significant here is that in most cases, the working class will frame these tensions as ones that are specifically class-based, as Karen Bell and Nisha Bevan have found in their work. So the top one is from Karen Bell's book, and the second one is from an article that she and Nisha Bevan wrote together. And this framing of class issues completely mirrors most of the responses that I get from others as well. They're explicitly using the language of class to indicate what they see as the problem. And some very common ones that I hear about environmentalists, both in the mainstream as well as in the degrowth movement, is that they're overly virtuous middle-class individuals, bougie middle-class academics, and there's a bunch of middle-class wankers. And the latter is probably the most common. We like to swear. And even when they don't explicitly use the language of class, as the organisers' comment about kissing frogs that I earlier referred to shows, they're highlighting problems that have emerged because of their repeated encounters with classism. And when I mentioned earlier that parallels can be drawn from parts of my work in the UK to elsewhere in the world, this notion of framing class issues as class-based ones, either directly or indirectly, is echoed by people spread out across the global north and south. And that this is both in relation to mainstream environmentalism as well as degrowth. And, you know, I think it's important to raise, I'm not suggesting that no one gets on. Of course, lots of working class and middle class people do, even when there's differences in cultures and tastes. But overall, if you zoom out, it's undeniable that the state of relations between the two classes is pretty shaky at best. And this context of social struggle, both historic and contemporary, within the population is missing from degrowth. And we need this context. It tells us who the working class actually are, and it tells us why focusing on class tensions and ambiguities is so important. Not everything that I've just run through is directly relevant to degrowth, for example, the chav trend. However, we need to understand that and we need to stress the importance of it, because working class lives, how they see the world and others around them, every component of their lives are shaped by all of these experiences. And this loss of context produces these very uncritical and superficial solutions to problems. So in a response to a remark that the degrowth movement represents the values, concerns and interests of the green European middle class, currently confined to the social space of highly educated left-wing individuals, it was suggested that perhaps degrowth needs more time to connect with broader movements, considering that it took Marx and Engels time to connect with the working class as well. Now, considering that the movement's been brewing for about half a century at this point, and they're still yet to actually make these connections, I think it's probably fair to say we should reorient how we're doing it and try a different approach, because degrowth is not, and it never will be, a build it and they'll come movement. So the importance of addressing these issues isn't just on moralistic grounds. It's not just to acknowledge and respect what the working class have endured. It's an inherently powerful movement building strategy in itself, because raising these issues and concerns creates this really magical fucking situation where people start to feel comfortable in each other's presence. And stereotypes about certain groups being judgmental or other such preconceptions start to melt away, because they feel listened to, respected, that they can place themselves in what is effectively a state of vulnerability by expressing their concerns. So to provide an incredibly common example that I come across are people's concerns surrounding language. So many people actually shy away from degrowth spaces because of the academic heavy language that they often use. A lot of working class people don't understand the terminology that they're throwing around. And it's not that they're incapable of understanding it, but people are afraid of being singled out, labelled stupid for asking what things mean. And this fear hasn't come out of nowhere. It very much stems from the derision that we're subject to in middle class spaces and in schools, universities, the workplace, past interactions with other environmentalists. And on one occasion, having this discussion didn't just highlight the need to change language to suit different demographics, but also for activists to, in their discussions about diversity and inclusion, which they hold on a periodic basis, to actually include classism as a topic of conversation in that as well, to explicitly say to them that they're valued and welcomed in these spaces. And it really helped, because for all of this time in most spaces, this just hasn't been the case. So it drives me absolutely bonkers when people say that talking about class tensions is divisive, that we shouldn't speak about it because we need to be unified, because it has the exact opposite effect. And we should always be looking out for bad faith actors who do want to use these problems as a springboard to sow further divisions. But we shouldn't let a few bad apples ruin it for the rest of us. And more importantly, these are conversations that many working class people have long been saying that they want to have. And what I feel contributes to the degrowth movement's inability to really understand the class struggle is how a lot of them conceptualise class itself. So for the most part, it's treated as a relation to the means of production, and I'm not arguing against the Marxist approach per se, but what's fundamental to be aware of is that the efficacy of a Marxist orientation, just like any other approach, is entirely contingent upon the context in which it's used. And in the context of community groups, local groups, and all of that, in the context of what I've been talking about here, exclusively treating class as a labour relation does not speak to the problem of classism and its lasting impacts. And I think this misguided approach stems from the fact that for a lot of people, their exposure to the working class has primarily been in books, to reading all these theories about us rather than actually spending time with us. And as Karen Bell points out, it obfuscates the nature of everyday class structures. Lawyers and doctors don't normally own the means of production. That doesn't make them working class. If somebody from a middle class family takes on a manual job for a month, that doesn't make a working class for a month. So when I hear from middle class degrowthers that we're all working class because we have to sell our labour for wages, that the term middle class is irrelevant, like, no, we are not the same. And to prove my point, I'd really invite any of them to go onto any council estate, old boozer or social club, and try and argue this out with them, and see what class and locals group them into. So we need an approach that allows us to acknowledge the sociality of class formation, maintenance and reproduction amongst the general population, and how this gives rise to multifarious forms of class-based discrimination. And here I like to follow Pierre Bourdieu, because he treats it as something formed through social relations, a pedagogical transmission of knowledge, where people learn about what the acceptable and unacceptable culture, values, taboos and tastes are from those around them, all of which underpins the maintenance of class structures. So taking this relational approach, who and what the working class really are can come to light. So as historically constituted beings, divergent in their nature from one era to the next. So by doing this, we don't fall into the trap of treating working class aspirations, concerns and values as universal. And it's not a case of having to choose one or the other, one categorization or the other, you can do both. And by taking a relational approach, it means that we can take an intersectional approach to class, because just focusing on social faction without consideration to race, gender, or other factors creates a tunnel vision, where we end up falling into the trap of reducing the working class into a universal entity. Now, it is important to highlight that not everyone's aware that these issues even exist. And what myself and others have found is that with other middle class activists, with those who've been raised to treat everyone with the respect that they deserve, no matter who they are or where they've come from, then this issue of middle class oppression and classism has never actually been on their agenda. And we'll never take any issue with people who are willing to step into these spaces that they didn't know existed before, people who are willing to learn about what the class struggle actually looks like from a working class perspective and the ways in which this might be overcome. But what I do take issue with is the people who've been confronted with this, who write about class in this utopianised form, whilst disregarding the existing literature and what the class struggle actually is. And now it's not everyone in the degrowth movement, but there are a lot of people out there who, despite being confronted with the facts and concerns, they're still dragging their feet, and they're not willing to reorient their position into one that faces reality. This is exactly what happens in mainstream environmental spaces, and this lack of consideration to the lives of those less privileged than them played a large part in the size of their movement stagnating, so especially in the case of Extinction Rebellion. And with regards to the degrowth movement, the academics have absolutely no excuse to overlook this. They know better than anyone how to conduct a literature review, and to say otherwise is just to be lazy, because they know where to find this information. Now, in 2020, an article was published which stated that more attention should be paid by degrowth to scholarship written from the perspectives of those marginalised by the growth economy. So people from less privileged positions, such as the working class in academia. And I completely agree with the authors here, especially as there's so much existing scholarship about working class life by the very people who've lived through it. It covers everything, attitudes to housing, healthcare, the middle class, environmentalism. So I would actually like to know why this still isn't happening to any notable degree, why this gap in the literature is still so big, why it's so difficult to find people who, in their work, in their academic work, actually lean on the perspectives of the working class, the very people that they claim to stand in alliance with. And the stakes of this silence are high for everyone, but the stakes are even higher and more pronounced for the academics. So Pierre Bourdieu draws focus to the fact that during periods of crisis, there's an increased chance that alternative ways of thinking and acting become influential. And in this context, intellectuals can take the role of, in his words, spokespersons of the dominated. And this is the situation that the movement's always been in. So a fairly select group of academics attracts a disproportionate amount of visibility from the broad population compared with, for example, an activist. And this is evidenced by the fact that when most people actually say who or what has drawn them into degrowth, more often than not, it will be a relatively short list of names and books. And with this level of visibility comes great influence. A fairly small group of academics have the power to shape the entire course of the movement, subsequently influencing how people come to adopt and self-internalise degrowth ideologies in everyday life. So we can look to the publication of the monthly review special issue on degrowth last year as a prime example of this. Now, for several years, we've seen conversations in the academic sphere circulate about degrowth's relation to eco-socialism. But through this one single issue that was fairly well promoted and circulated in a public setting, there was this explosion of interest in eco-socialism virtually overnight, So we saw loads of people taking an increased interest in it, and that's myself included as well. Many people now identify as eco-socialists. It also, for example, sparked continued interest in democratic planning amongst a lot of people, which the movement, by their own admission, hadn't given enough attention to it in the past as it should have. So this issue single-handedly reshaped how a lot of people across the world conceptualise and approach degrowth, so it completely changed its course. So to be able to reach so many people so quickly and at a global scale, it's an exponential source of strength. And in many ways it is, as we just saw with the monthly review issue. But conversely, in the case of their continued silence surrounding working class politics and this proliferation of a pseudo-class struggle that only exists in a binary form, it's an exponential source of weakness. And although everyone, no matter who you are, is responsible for their actions, for those who are able to exert such a vast level of influence, this responsibility is even greater. Now, on the one hand, I do feel that a lot of people, a fair amount of activists, need prompting to consider class perspectives. And this would be an incredibly powerful way to prompt people at a global scale rapidly to make it happen. And on the other hand, the academics are the voices that most people hear for the first time. In degrowth spaces, more so than anyone, they set the tone for the degrowth movement. And right now, this tone does not represent nor fully speak to the working class. And if you can't see where you fit into a given movement, you'll just remove yourself from it. Now, I'm not suggesting that people blindly follow the words of others. As with any decentralised movement, people are free to adopt it to suit the interests of different demographics. And in the last year or so, I've noticed a vocal increase on the part of activists who want to talk about class privilege, class tensions, who want to be more inclusive by adopting class perspectives in the work that they do. But their efforts don't attract the same degree of visibility through no fault of their own. But because they and their efforts don't attract the same degree of visibility, it's very difficult, in some cases it's impossible, for outsiders to see that there are inclusive spaces for the working class in the degrowth movement. And it's a striking contradiction in people's behaviour to denounce imperialism, racism, the patriarchal society, who acknowledge that their actions can further entrench these injustices, but yet to do so with classism. And this isn't always going to be relevant. Not everything in life is about class. But in all of these discussions about convivial, pluralistic societies, all of these discussions about how to create a better life for all, lives rid of all of these forms of injustice that exist now, where does classism fit in and what do they plan to do about it? What about our forms of discrimination? Because we can't work together to resolve it by ourselves. It needs to be a reciprocal process. And this isn't a case of whataboutism. These should all be denounced side by side. But failure to do so is dangerously short-sighted. So from a movement building perspective, considering that all forms of domination and oppression are interlinked with the subjugation of the working class in all areas of life in all parts of the world. And yeah, the ruling class are at the top of the chain, but the middle class are a part of that chain as well. And for the most part, this remains unacknowledged and unchallenged. And this lack of working class representation and class perspectives feeds into a much broader problem within the movement in terms of whose voices are heard and whose perspectives are made apparent. So the Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance, or FADA, are a network of academics, activists and practitioners. And in an article written last year, their writing collective asked, how has one strand of degrowth become a proxy for a much broader whole? They draw focus to the numerous people who have raised questions in the past about why in degrowth scholarship, feminist, decolonial and anti-racist voices are underrepresented or misrepresented in characterizations. When I go to conferences, countless people have asked this, with increasing frustration each year. And the fact that this is still a question people are asking is absolutely absurd. Why is it in 2024 that the voices that are heard above all else in the degrowth movement are almost always Eurocentric, white, academically educated and middle class? A collective who do not fully represent the needs of others because they can't, No collective or demographic can do that. But why is it that despite this critique being very well known, both within and outside of the movement, that things are yet to change? Now, FAD advocate for the creation of new spaces for underrepresented voices to emerge, and I completely agree with this. And it's actually some really great work that's actually being done by people who have carved out their own spaces. But alongside this, I do contend that it's up to some people in the movement who have failed to give way to underrepresented perspectives to emerge, who have failed to be more self-critical about themselves, that they need to start listening to what they hear in these spaces, to actually give space for these underrepresented voices and directions to influence them and their work, which might just be the very thing that's needed to attract a much broader following, because it's not unless something changes, it's not going to happen. And harking back to Locke's definition of classism, when people occupying lower social class levels are treated in ways that exclude, devalue, discount, and separate them, what becomes clear is that degrowth, as most people recognise it, so the Eurocentric, white, middle class, and academically educated strands that most people are familiar with, is not only developing in a class blind manner, it's developing in a way that's inherently classist by definition. And even if it's never someone's intention to be classist, that doesn't mean that they're immune from reproducing it. And it's undeniable that by ignoring, downplaying, or dismissing the issue of class tensions and bad faith arguments as divisive, that this devalues us by denying and subsequently erasing our history. It excludes us from participation because, on speaking with a fair amount of people, they take this as an indicator that they're not equally valued. They separate off into their own groups where they know they'll be respected and listened to, and they end up becoming discounted. And if you end up erasing our histories, then you erase the chance to mobilise with us. Because if we're denied the dignity and respect to bring to the table our own struggles, then we're not going to hang around. We'll do it by ourselves. This is a non-negotiable demand that should never have been a demand in the first place. And retreating, as we all know, is absolutely cataclysmic to movement building. And as I've mentioned already, people really want to have these conversations. So in a research interview with Canadian participants back in 2021, they stressed the importance of the degrowth movement better addressing aspirations of underrepresented working class individuals and groups. And we know that working class aspirations transcend material interests. They want to feel included and know that they'll be respected by people themselves, which for a lot of people just isn't evidential. And this failure for organisations to accommodate the needs of others is highlighted by Linda Stahl, an activist who founded her own organisation and wrote a book about it. I actually would really recommend this book. And she stressed the importance of looking inwards, of being more self-reflective, because we're often so focused on what we're trying to achieve in the empirical sense, our end goals, that we often forget what we need to do on a day-to-day basis to ensure that people want to keep turning up to our meetings, mobilising with us and engaging with us. And when we're not getting it right, rather than dismissing or downplaying the problem for whatever reason, grow up and confront what might be an uncomfortable truth to hear. For example, in one of the activist groups that I'm in, it transpired that we were being ableist with how we ran our meetings without realising. When we got together in person, the spaces weren't that accessible for people with mobility issues. Our online meetings didn't have text-to-speech, which some people actually needed. And hearing that we were being ableist was uncomfortable, but it was something that we needed to hear in order to fix it. So dismantling oppressive structures on any level is bound to be uncomfortable at times. And I think a lot of people would agree that if the entire process is comfortable, then we're not doing it right. I think the degrowth movement are a little bit afraid of, kind of getting a bit gritty at times. And even when there hasn't been any ambiguities or tensions between parties, and there are a lot of middle class people in the degrowth movement who I know personally, where this has never been an issue between us. But that in no way it means that we should skirt over it, because our experiences aren't universal. And I would never dream to tell my comrades in the global south that talking about white privilege was divisive and irrelevant. It is basic integrity to listen to people when they want to articulate matters important to them. So if I hear these phrases in the top right corner, as to reasons why we shouldn't talk about class tensions one more time, and you can quote me on this, I will lean out of the nearest window in despair. I will scream into the abyss until I lose my voice, and then I'll launch myself directly into the sun. Help. If it was only ever myself who received these rebuttals, then that would be reason for me to reflect on my approach, but it's not. Other people have long run into these rebuttals time and time again, which significantly is never actually backed up by any empirical information to say that actually no. Confronting classism head-on is antithetical to movement building, and no, that the class struggle from the perspective of the working class themselves is inconsequential. And they haven't provided any evidence because it doesn't exist. The defences are just moralistic, and tellingly, myself and others have never received these responses from other working class people either. This is misguided middle class moralism. So just to explain, the microwave brain is how I feel on the inside, the slide dog is how I look on the outside. I resonate with these. And this recent quote from Matt Huber really encapsulates the shared frustration that myself and a lot of people hold here. That the fact that this resistance to even acknowledge the actual class struggle for what it actually is, let alone having people confront their own class privilege themselves, remains so high in the degrowth movement. So many of us are still struggling to be able to impose our definition of the world, our objective realities, and it's a definition which brings to light the fact that no, the class struggle is not an aggregate phenomenon. And yes, there are tensions and ambiguities between the middle class, but these are not unresolvable. But we have to make an active effort to remediate them. And being told that our concerns and lived experience are invalid our entire lives, we are sick to the back teeth at this point of hearing it again, watching yet again the attempted erasure of our history. So to round up everything that I've said today, while there are lots of people really making the effort in this slide, who want to understand what the class struggle looks like to the working class, how it's experienced, how this impacts our ability to build a movement, and the ways that it can be overcome. But there's a lot more people who aren't. And to stress again, for people unaware of these issues, we're never going to be frustrated because you just don't know what you don't know. But there are a lot of people who do. There are a lot of academics who do, and they're being lazy. And for reasons I just can't work out, they continue to refuse to admit what is and has always been objective reality. So to put things as simply as I possibly can, there's a fair few people in the degrowth movement who need to stop being so morally righteous and just please prevent me from launching myself into the sun at lightning speed in unwavering despair and just pull your fucking fingers out. Really? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Powerful, provocative, and profound talk. That isn't too many P's, like picking up a penguin. Well, I've got lots of things I could say, but I'm going to shut up for a bit anyway and throw it open to the audience for any questions or comments. We just made it another percent.
Thank you. Yeah, in 1971, the government of Bhutan decided to set aside GDP as sort of primary economic modelling system and institute GDH, so gross domestic happiness, that stood for, and it resulted in this kind of big emphasis on the environment, environmental protection, healthcare for all, so far as it could be realised meaningfully, and a kind of expansion of leisure time, prioritised over expansion of productive labour time, and so on, as a kind of macroeconomic model, it's kind of statewide economic model. I think it's an interesting example of something that kind of pushes the envelope. Do you have a sense of, obviously we're interested in sort of the importance of grassroots movements here and so on, but at that sort of macroeconomic level, do you have a suggestion as to what a useful model might kind of look like that moves beyond GDP and kind of tries to realise degrowth at that sort of statewide level? If that makes sense.
I turned it off. Whoops. I actually don't, and I think it's because these models need to come out of a collective endeavour, really. And what's coming out from people who are spending a lot of time with working class environment, with the working class, is they're saying that people are moving away from these really progressive ideas, like you mentioned, and the happiness index, because you've got these people that are just coming in and being like, we've got this great idea, you're going to love it, you're going to be so happy, and they have no input whatsoever. So, I mean, I'd say it probably would centre around traditional working class values, because for the ones that are actually quite into degrowth, they're actually seeing it as something that comes alongside that. But apart from values, I would say it probably should be a joint project. So I think that's actually how you're going to get them to get on board with it.
What Bhutan is not a democracy. Okay, something. Anybody, a young woman, for example, before we let all the men talk, like the men. Yes.
Would you say that it's possible to understand the working class struggle without being working class yourself?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of great academics who, you know, just speak with them. You know, I don't think you have to be working class to understand it. It helps. But I think really it's just taking the time to read, to listen to people. I think really to be willing to question your own privileges, but it's definitely not a barrier to it at all. But I would say it's a little bit harder, I think, because sometimes they can reproduce slightly class blind subjectivity. So one person said to me, you know, really supportive of the working class, but they said, oh, well, we really should help all the world's destitute. And I was like, please don't call us that. So they can, but I think they just, if you're middle class and you're going for a class perspective, I think you just need to be a bit sort of more mindful of what, you know, how you go about it.
Okay. Yeah, the question online, but yourself.
I thought it was really interesting when you talked about the green politics being seen as middle class. There was recently in the Scottish Parliament, there was a comment by an MSP who labelled the entire Green Party as wine bar revolutionaries. So I thought it was quite an interesting comment that you made regarding that. I think it's very true. I think Green Party politics is seen as quite middle class.
Yeah, I was at the conference in Brighton, and I think I was the only common person there. I swore, and I think like their eyes popped out there, and I was like, oh, okay, but yeah, so middle class. I mean, they're lovely, but still.
Somebody online?
Yeah, got a question from Eric. He said, thanks for the talk. Have you made any experiences that we might learn from where you managed to get understanding for working class perspectives, not only in a way of mindset, but one that actually changed the organizational dynamic and transformed the political work one does together? Like, especially when it comes to dealing with emotions, people being angry, etc., and developing understanding for it, but not in a moralistic way, which most often feels rather paternalistic, but in an actual human way.
I would say I haven't actually achieved that, all of that. That would be great. I'd say that kind of the closest one that I can think of in recent times, actually, with degrowth. There's a really great bunch of people who set up what's called the International Degrowth Network. And part of the reason why it was set up because degrowth movement's very academic and they wanted to take that way. They're very aware of their sort of middle class status and that most of them are actually from the global north as well. So they set up all these networks with loads of different people, and one of them came to me and essentially sent me a document and said, how does this resonate with them? And, you know, I think it is just that mutual, I guess, respect with it, but I'll be honest, a little bit pessimistic. We haven't done it yet. I'd say it's the closest one. But.
Yeah, thanks, very interesting talk. I'm just wondering, coming from the working class, why do we need to align ourselves with the middle class? Because they have ruined a lot of movements down the years, left politics, left academia, Nigel Trill, for example, don't quote me on that. And they seem to be a barrier in the way of a lot of action. So they've dominated this movement. And then why do we have to align ourselves with it? I know we need to build solidarity and mass movement, but they have stood in the way of a lot of action over the years. So can we do it without them?
In a box. I think we have to. I think although we're, you know, the biggest class of action, there is loads of them. But I think if we're thinking along the lines of degrowth, most of them are academics and policymakers, and even though they're nowhere near sort of, I guess, the point where they can exert political influence, they still play like this really valuable role where they can. And for me, I think that's where middle class power really comes from, because they, and I mean this in a really nice way, they just don't have like that grit. You know, we take a brick to a window. I'm not saying like brick windows, but it's kind of this like when I go to like middle class sort of protests, it's all very fluffy and stuff. So I totally get what you're saying. They've ruined many movements. I think we need to align with them on our own terms. I see it go wrong every time when they just try and, I guess, welcome all the working class in, which is nice. But what ends up happening is they keep doing it their way, for example, like language or meetings. So I think if we are going to align with them, we need to be sort of autonomous in our own groups so we can, I guess, do it on equal terms, if that makes sense.
Thanks. Yeah, there's been a lot of things mentioned about like the paternalism of the middle class and like and the idea that they quite often like punch down into like the communities that have been directly detrimental, like through no fault really of their own, like sort of like coal mine communities in England and Wales perhaps. How do we stop that sort of like that paternalism turning into like smugness and trying to embarrass people who's, when times of like hardship came, found solidarity in that what we found later to be a pretty bad thing for this movement?
I think, how do you sort of take away the smugness? I think I guess to build on my last question, I think we should just put them in boxes. I don't know, and I think maybe I'm a little bit sort of pessimistic still because I'm actually seeing some issues with the mining community at the moment. But I think we really need to, I guess, lean on our allies, people who have sort of access to these networks. So academics, policymakers, people in positions of influence at an organisational level, because they can essentially cancel out anyone who are bad faith actors. Because, you know, I guess in mining communities, for as powerful as the working class are, they're unlikely to have, I guess, that level of influence. So yeah, I'd say we need to lean on sort of those existing networks.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I think that was really interesting. I'm just sort of thinking about the history, I suppose, of environmental organising in Ireland, and I would see it a bit that there's two main aspects of it. One, like a rather like city, urban-based, institutionally focused on, you know what I mean, on things including the Green Party, maybe also Extinction Rebellion, these things, and then also more, you know, groups that have resisted in their communities against projects that are being built in those communities, that are usually being built in rather like peripheral areas, you know, and there I see the class dynamic is quite different, you know, that it is usually it's very normal people doing pretty radical things against the state. So that was a bit my question, is if you see also that, you know, this kind of diversity within the movement.
You say, do I see this diversity within
the movement in Ireland, for example? I think to me it's quite obvious that also like the most potential lies actually in these working class communities, that like also often rural communities, but resisting against us, and that it might be. Yeah,
I do see the diversity, but I think at the moment it's hidden, especially in England. Working class voices are nominal, and generally when they get together, they don't have, for example, these big social media accounts or stuff. So it is brewing under the surface, but I think what disenfranchises a lot of people is that they can't see how they're part of the bigger picture. So it is, but it's hidden. So hopefully we'll make some noise soon.
Is there any way that you can somehow meet on a neutral ground? The trouble is that once you open your mouth, almost immediately you know where they're from. Either they're from left-wing intellectuals who have working class roots, or just plain old middle class, which is a huge problem. You know what I mean? I think that it's very difficult not to be, or not to be seen to be quite condescending to anybody, in the other class. And the same goes, I'm sure, for people in the upper class. In fact, how many upper class people involved in the growth movement? You know?
Oh, I don't think so. No.
Well, should we be bringing them on board too?
Yeah.
Why?
No, we want that money, Brie, they can say,
We'd have to eat them.
eat the rich.
Yeah.
Well, would they be very nourishing on indigestible, I'd say.
Peter and then Carol.
Yeah, there's a lot that's interesting going on in your presentation, and I think it's true that we need to take on board the observations of capitalism that the class struggle brings to the table. But I thought that the most important thing you said about class really was your qualification, that it's a profoundly intersectional struggle. And I think we should welcome the fact that environmentalists, even if they are middle class, but hopefully they're not just middle class, are actually putting the economy front, left, and centre of the critique, because it's the social economic system that, and also the subjectivity, the attention economy that goes along with dominant capital, that needs to be critiqued, deconstructed, and tackled. And I think the weakness that I would see in maybe caricaturing some of the dynamics, the dismissal of working class people, is that we miss out in the reality that this is it's multiple conversations. And some of the most important are coming from outside the European experience. In fact, the post-development conversations, the indigenous conversations are a wholesale attack on the Euro-modern project. And you won't get to that point from an exclusively class-based analysis. We need those critiques as well. So I think that, I accept a lot of what you're saying, but I think there's a little bit of caricaturing and maybe slightly premature to dismiss the collection of conversations that are going on, which represents a very profound shift from middle class environmentalism, described from trying to categorize the struggle in purely environmental terms to one that's challenging both political economy and the European origins, the imperial colonial origins of that project.
I completely agree with you, and I think when you mentioned sort of slightly premature, actually you're right. I think in the been working closely most of it in the UK and Europe, and I think at the moment it's premature just because we can't even kind of get that out of the door first. And as you say, it sort of opens into these much broader conversations that we need to have. And I almost feel like myself and a few other people just stuck in this point, just going around in circles. So yeah, I agree.
Carl and then go online.
Thanks, Ella. That was really interesting. Obviously, a lot of what you said there is that the middle class are a barrier to the working class taking part in a lot of these environmental movements and stuff, which is totally true. I totally agree with you. But what about, and I know you sort of touched on it a little bit there, but what about some of the other factions of the working class which are identify with the current system as well, and particularly in Northern Ireland, how do we deal with them as well, and how do we get them on board? Because it's not just that the degrowth movement itself shooting itself in the foot, which it is, but they're also extra, hegemonic forces which try as well, which try and get the working class on board as well. There's a lot of working class people who identify with growth, and they see it as a rising tide, floats all ships, which is, things like these things which are which are meant to get the working class on board and stuff. But there's also groups who would oppose grassroots organising at a level, particularly in Northern Ireland. We call them paramilitaries as well. Might not be with this particularly unique circumstance, but other working class groups who also oppose democratic organisations, democratic movements as well, and environmental movements. How do you think that we deal with those as well, not just the middle classes?
Yeah, the sort of this idea that we need to grow is actually so tricky. And somebody he's worked for an NGO for about 20 years, and he said that all the working class people refused free bikes as part of a bike scheme because they wanted to buy cars. For them, that is what I guess success looks like. And that's that's difficult. And I think we really need to, I guess, I don't know. I would love to say I've got like the magic idea for how do you get people, I guess, to step away from the idea of growth, but I think it might be more conducive to, I guess, join them in their everyday struggles and get to know them. Because I think as soon as you go in with this idea of growth versus non-growth, especially in the UK with our relationship to austerity politics, you just get people's backs up. And in terms of opposed to grassroots organisation, again, it's difficult because outside organisations who try to work with communities are rejected because they're not part of their own kind. So I guess it was the best chance, I guess myself and others have found, is reaching out, I guess, to a trusted member of an existing organisation in that area, because effectively that person can vouch for you and say, oh, this person's all right.
I got a question from Damien. He said, why are the working class so switched off about climate breakdown and the guilty middle classes increasingly switched on?
Well, they're not switched off. When you say switched off, how do you, so I know you might have to type, do you mean like climate denial or lack of action? I guess I can answer both. So recent studies found, I think it's about 77% of people in the UK are incredibly concerned about the climate crisis. One problem that's really impacting our ability to mobilise beyond just saying, oh, I haven't got time or whatever, is this increasing idea of fatalism. And so that's even, I mean, that's with everyone, I think it's fair to say, but it's even more pronounced with the working class who, you know, can't even mobilise to, you know, get their bills down to a reasonable price. So fatalism, I think, really is the biggest thing that we have to grapple with. As well as, you know, people saying, well, how do I get involved? Because if you go up to somebody and say, do you want to join my movement? You know, it doesn't work like that. So I think outreach, but yeah, I think really fatalism at the moment is definitely in England. I don't know what it's like over here, but that is our biggest issue, I'd say.
I think the very word degrowth is a kind of turn off. I don't know what could be, but maybe good growth. Growth for all, or anything, but degrowth is so negative.
Thank you. It's so bad, isn't it? It's so bad. Some people actually like to call it a circular economy. And I know some people would, I think there are people like, oh, it's actually a part of degrowth, you know, it's not on its own, but I don't care what people call it. But yeah, it's such a bad word. I don't like it. And they want it to be like a missile word to provoke people, but there's a limit between provoking someone and then just provoking them so much they go away.
Good growth, that's the image you want. You know, because there are lots of things that need to be done.
Yeah.
Jobs to be done. It's
Yeah.
just the resources to do it are being blocked. The ruling class are not interested.
So, but is it? Yeah. And online.
Thanks very much for a great talk. I'm just thinking pragmatically about movement building. It kind of touches on what was said here about caricature. And is the battle not around identifying the ruling class and redistribution and removing control of the ruling class? Because I sit here as I don't know if I'm a middle class trader or I'm a peasant proprietor relic class, but it actually, what is to be won and how can we get it? And does identify, a lot of people, working class activists or, and people that I interact with don't really don't want to evoke their working class origin, but they want to attack the ruling class. And is that not the front that we should be targeting? I mean, degrowth for me, I said to my parents when we were leaving, when I was leaving to come, I'm going to talk about degrowth. And they absolutely, what the hell is it really? What does that mean? But it is about, you know, we want to redistribute the wealth that the ruling class are holding. So maybe the working class battle just needs to be left to the side. We need to convince the middle class that they need to draw a line somewhere? Sorry, I'm very unsophisticated, but
Oh, no, no. No, that makes perfect sense. And I think the battle is about doing that, but also alongside addressing these tensions, because essentially this is just getting people in the door. This isn't even about mobilising like people like we do not want to spend time with these people. So it is actually quite, I guess, a narrow argument. But we just can't get in the bloody door. Like, so Karen Bell's book, Working Class Environmentalism, which I'd really recommend, really touches upon this. You know, they're doing all these great activities, but they just want to remain apart. And it's not obviously going to be the only thing that causes issues, but I think once you get people into the same room on common ground, that's when you can really go for the elite and go for the redistribution. But we just need more relatability than we've got at the moment.
Yeah, got a question from Linda Sullivan, who said, is it perhaps the case that a lot of working class activism goes under the radar? We're not recognised in spaces who favour more theoretical posturing. For example, there's a lot of radical organising going on in community gardens in West Belfast, talking about food sovereignty, cracking capitalism, mutual aid, and much, much more that are core tenets of degrowth. It's just not recognised as such.
Oh, absolutely. And especially where, you know, they can get these really like sort of nice things together with the middle class can. They get not just visibility in terms of their own networks, but they also attract sort of the media, news, other outlets, and working class people normally only have themselves in a room. So yeah, absolutely. They remain under the radar, and there are groups who, if they hadn't have reached out to me, I'd never know that they'd even existed. So when we talk about working class mobilisation and efforts, I think it is quite worthwhile saying we don't fully know what they are, because where are they? Right.
Or let Peter back in for a second. Anybody else who hasn't spoken?
I promise this is my last comment. Yeah, I think the language of degrowth is problematic. I think, all right. My observation there is that growth is a big part of the problem. And by the way, I think it's important that we're from the degrowth movement. We are naming growth as an alibi for inequality. That's one of the major functions on behalf of the working class that growth services. So while growth is the problem, degrowth doesn't quite capture the solution. And I think better language for it is the well-being economy, where dignity, equality, repurposing the economy, circularity, all of those, and the post-development debate, the indigenous attack on your modern project, that it's a more pluralist, agonistic kind of conversation when you talk about the well-being economy. And it's also pluriverse. It's not about replacing one singular universal model with another, but it's championing context-specific responses to inequality and the design of development according to your own region or ecology. So those are some closing comments.
No, I agree. I just wanted to say about the well-being economy. I love it because well-being means something personal to all of us in our own different ways. And when we, have that emotional connection that, I guess you can see where you fit into it, I guess. And when you know where you fit into a movement, you will go for it. So yeah, balance of that. Yes.
Aside from the Karen Bell book that you mentioned, is there any other books or material that you recommend?
Ooh, so this one, if you haven't read it, there is, let me just get my citation manager up, sorry. Somebody asks you something, you forget every bloody book you've read. So there is a woman called Betsy Leonda Wright. She wrote a book called Missing Class, Strengthening Social Movements. If for whatever reason you can't find it, tell John to find me and I'll send it over. And this is she wrote it in her time in America with those activists. But she also really talks about language as well. And this is something that a lot of people don't pay enough attention to, how we like to speak, Also, my second favourite one is David Graeber's Direct Action. That is absolutely, it's an absolute fucking cracker. It's not just sort of an ethnographic study, but it's his time in the movement as well. And that touches not just on class, but also on race as well, which I think is absolutely vital. But yeah, those 1, 2, 3, those 4, yeah. I also have a much longer list, and if anyone wants to know, just let me know. But I think I'll be here a long time. Like.
I guess a question about student politics and the kind of how working class and middle class activists. I guess kind of from an English electoral kind of perspective, I guess kind of in the wake of like Jeremy Corbyn and that kind of being caricatured in kind of a oftentimes slandered way that it's middle class students who are leading this movement, and it's and kind of taking away from any of the kind of working class environmental kind of almost sort of semi-coalition that was kind of there in the Labour years now. It's kind of like, I guess kind of the big question is where do you see the UK Labour Party in the wake of all these kind of issues? Because I don't know what to do.
No, they're just Tories in red ties, really, aren't they? I mean, I think, we're obviously going to get stuck with Keir Starmer, and I think we're going to have to basically work in spite of them, rather than with them. No, I don't know where I see him. Like,
You have to try to be with, but pushing.
yes, pushing him in the right direction, but I think you know he's almost trying to go. Well, he is going as right as he can, Keir. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
It's the reasons why he's repeating what Tony Blair did.
Yeah.
Tony Blair MP is an anagram of I am Tory Plan B.
It's like you've already got like the vote. You know, the Tories have screwed it up so badly that they're going to get it. So I was like, what's he doing? I don't know.
Yeah.
This is like the easiest win ever.
Could I make maybe a few observations on that, give people a chance to think, is that degrowth is about as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit. I mean, it suffers from a completely negative connotation, and if you're explaining something, you're losing. Because if you look behind what degrowth is about redistribution, bits the economy grow, bits decline. But degrowth, when you can't put food on the table, it's a language of sacrifice, a language of privilege. So I do think it suffers from a very serious, PR problem from that perspective. And the reality is nobody, as far as I know, in history ever had a revolution for less. Come join my movement for degrowth, and it has to be the politics of abundance or plenitude, but it's about articulating that in a different way. And that's where there are some difficult issues for working class communities. And I speak probably out of an observation from my experience in Dublin working class communities, or saying it here in parts of Belfast, of consumerism. I come from a Catholic background, but I'm a completely collapsed one, as many of you know. But you see the ostentatiousness around communions and confirmations have now become the celebrations of consumerism, and yet people are doing it out of love, out of a sense of, honouring what that means. So there is a conversation to be had about working class communities who have bought into this, whether it was Tom or Carl talking about buying into this consumer treadmill. But at the same time, it can't just be for less. It's about redistribution and finding pleasure. And there's too little talk of pleasure, of sensuality. It's all the language of sacrifice that you get in the Green. We're like the teetotaler at the party. Don't you be drinking and no dancing as well. We really do have in the Green movement, broadly speaking, need to start talking about a politics of more, of better, but not in the way that capitalism has promised this to us. That's the key issue, is that growth, as we currently construct, is capital accumulation. Honestly, does your heart sing whenever you hear in the BBC, GDP growth has gone up by 2%? And are you in the doldrum of depression when GDP has fallen? What we want is good jobs, good healthcare, decent public, system. That's what we want. And the promise is that we can have that without growth. That's the key. Would you lead with that? This is, I think, Emma's point. You lead with the good stuff. With that degrowth, it just will not attract anybody. And it's that reality that when you're explaining, you're losing. So I don't know whether, in a way to, kind of a working class climate politics has to be in that broad space in a way that I just outlined, and whether you'd agree.
Yeah, and they kind of, the degrowth movement have kind of gone from like one extreme to the other. So where they went on this over focus of consumption and all this voluntary simplicity crap, when it finally clocked that, as you say, it's not going to get anyone on board. Following that, they're just like almost obsessed. Oh shit, keep doing that. They're almost like obsessed with planning to the extent where I just don't see much conversations happening, as you say, on like pleasure, on the little things. So I think a lot of they're almost like struggling to find that balance, if that makes sense. Because where they've not spoken about planning before in a lot of circles, they go, oh shit, we know nothing. So we need to do all these conversations now. And it's just getting lost. I just
Anyway, hasn't spoken yet. A lot of men speaking here. That's all fine. You go, Carl, yourself, and then Wes. Okay.
Well, good introduction. Actually, my question is about Emma as well. It's about John, sort of what you were saying there as well, is that we're not just challenging, we're not just saying everybody's going to get more in the same terms. We're saying it's going to be qualitatively different type of more. It's not just capital accumulation. But a lot of whenever we talk about this, we know that that type of capitalism is also intrinsically linked to patriarchy as well. And those, accumulating more and sort of gathering more, and it seems very masculine as well. And we're just wondering as well, if you're talking about this, that's already quite a challenge as well. But what about you talking about intersectionality as well, of being, of your position as, as a woman as well? And have you struggled to be taken seriously whenever you're talking about, because I feel it's a struggle for us to be taken seriously whenever we're talking about degrowth as well. These are challenging concepts as well, but there's a strong link between capitalism and growth and as well masculinity and patriarchy as well. Just do you have any reflections or experiences as well of that?
Yeah, that's my life. Yeah, it's always difficult. I think, and this is one thing that a lot of women get as well. When you're being direct, you're called angry and aggressive. Now that there's a difference between being rude, because some people are just being angry and aggressive, but if a woman pushes back on something a man says, oh, you just don't understand it. And it's been made even worse when it's clear that I'm working class, because then it's even like, not only are you aggressive, but you're like thick as well. Get back in your tunnel, wherever. So it is a struggle. It's a lot better in some places than others, but I think overall, yeah, it's not fun.
Have you thought about how this links to debates on just transition?
When you say...
So just transition in terms of energy?
Oh yeah, no, when you say how this links, sorry, I don't quite follow.
So do you think this links to debates on just transition?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'd say it does, because again, I was actually speaking to somebody in the energy sector last week, and he said the problem with the just transition is that they're trying to create a just transition without working class voices, and a lot of the time he'll be sort of reeled out to give like a talk, and then they'll send him off. They won't take on anything he said. So I guess, yeah, it is just it's very relevant, because we just need to increase the presence, and they need to let them through the door, because otherwise you're going to get policy resistance, which we know is on the rise. So yeah, absolutely.
I would just say it's absolutely central, because the carbon energy system is heavily dominated by the working class. I mean, if you go to Aberdeen, all those jobs associated with the North Sea oil and gas industry. But the just transition means anything. It's about where are the good, high-paid, unionized jobs for people who can no longer dig coal or mine, and that. We haven't really had that discussion, I think, in terms of that transition or transformation in terms of class.
It just feels relevant, because I think in terms of that debate, you have a lot of people talking about, well, it's not that we don't want to produce energy anymore, it's that we're going to produce it in this different way. And it's a positive thing.
But it's about, I think a jobs-led way of talking about it is much more attractive than degrowth. We want good, decent, well-paid jobs, good public sector services, and so on. That's much more attractive, I think, than this language, which is often a woke, educated, middle-class milieu of essentially guilty people who feel guilty about their privilege. that then you embark on a process of voluntary, reduction. It's only when you have quite a lot you can have that luxury of reducing your consumption and so on. So I think actually from a Marxist point of view, which is where Emma is coming from, don't focus on consumption, it's production. That's what you need to focus on. And that I think has been missing for quite a while in our politics, where it has been around consumption and policy and so on. I'm just teeing up Wes here for his question and relating to production.
No, it is actually, it relates to, I suppose, the political class and the green movement. They don't talk like we've spoken there about the politics of good jobs and a good life and quality healthcare. And they don't think about how the working class, including farmers and fishermen, have to bear the cost of a lot of this. And there's a danger in the green movement of losing the working class to populism, where they do talk about distribution, but in a different way, the distribution of power from the elites. And I think the green movement really needs to wake up and actually talk about distribution, redistribution, as part of that creation of good jobs. Because just looking at what's happening in Dublin lately and the rise of populism on the far right, they're getting into the working class communities and are pitching us against the elite. But I don't see the Greens doing it in a productive way. They do it almost in a punishing way when they talk about you have to change. You have to bear the cost of this wind farm. You have to change your farming practices. You need to do it now. There's none of the positive talk, and there's also none of that talk about the redistribution of wealth, the immense wealth that's in the country. So maybe a question on the risk of losing the working class to populism, particularly the far right across Europe and scarcely in Ireland all of a sudden.
I'm genuinely concerned. So like when I was at the Green Party conference, they're all really nice and the policies are really progressive, but they're not emphasising the working class at all. They're not trying to reach them like actively. And in England, we have this far right organisation called the British Democrats. And if you actually look at some of the stuff they do in isolation, completely out of context, it's really progressive. They make little care packages for homeless people. They have these little reading books for kids, and the reading books are just normal reading books. And it also teaches the adults how to educate their children. And they go into these deprived areas and they're basically making their lives better in the material sense. So I really think that the green movement needs to go into these areas on an everyday level, because this is what the far right are doing. They're taking on, they're appropriating this sort of economic deprivation, saying, well, we're the only ones who are going to be here for you because we have been. But what's I do get, and I don't know if anyone else has this, I do get this with some leftists. They say, we're not interested in the far right, leave them to their own devices. Like they're uneducated, they're stupid. And I'm like, look, you don't have to justify it, you don't have to agree with it, but we have to work with it. And I find a lot of people are just like, we're not interested. It's just moralism again. But
it's probably one of the unique features of the island of Ireland in comparison to the UK. Farming and agriculture is our biggest area of greenhouse gas emissions. And we've already seen in Europe the kind of a populist farmer-led movement in the Netherlands. There's talk about one, down south, and there's a gap there that people have questions, they're angry, the health system has fallen apart, there's no housing, and if the left won't provide answers, well, the right will. And so I think our challenge here on the island is going to be around the just transition in agriculture, not necessarily in energy. And I don't think we've really begun to think through that, because most left-wing, never mind green movements, are very urban-based. And the point you made about Save Our Sperrins or the anti-fracking movement, that's where I think the hammer's going to fall on, the reaction to climate. Yes, yourself and then Tom.
So they just sort of, so what's stopping the left from accessing these communities? Because like if we're talking now and then like the middle class is having difficulty accessing these working class communities, then how can the establishment figures, Johnson and Farage and Trump over the water, they're far more removed from these people. They have much more of a need to want nothing to do, so to speak, with the working classes, and they can mobilise and fight. So why do the people that have more in common, that actually want the help of rather than the fury of the working class. Why, you know what I mean? Like, I don't understand how that manages to bridge that gap rather than what seems on paper like a much easier situation to handle.
How can multimillionaires be heroes of the working class?
So that's the thing though, isn't it? Like they present themselves sort of as caricatures of people. Like Boris Johnson actually makes himself look like a scruff before he goes on TV. Nigel Farage has to go down the pub and say something controversial. You know, I remember when Boris was mayor, I don't know if anyone saw him like getting stuck on a zip wire. And this was before no one really knew that Boris was a bad person. He was, you know, and this is a thing that the right are very good at taking the piss out of themselves. They're very good, you know, making themselves look like the everyday person. But actually, when you look at the left, Keir Starmer's like a lizard. I'm sorry, but I don't see emotion from him. The Green Party, again, they're all very nice, but if I was disenfranchised, I don't see how I'd relate to them at all. And again, with the right people, with the right politicians, there are so many people that you could effectively say, oh, I could go for a pint with them. And they say something controversial, but you know, somebody needs to say it. So it's kind of they're making themselves relatable, kind of.
Last question to Tom.
Yeah, it was just to come back to the just transition question, maybe underscore a point and leave it in your question, but the just energy transitions absolutely completely bound up with everything you've been talking about. We're reconfiguring the energy system now through a transition. We can reconstitute the same class relationships and biases that we currently have and the same labor relations and so forth in a different form. So we can reconstitute these problems, or we can use it as an opportunity to kind of refresh, build, improve, and develop and bring in some of the sorts of, you know, solutions that you were talking about. So completely, like, inextricably linked. And in fact, the just transition element, I mean, just is a flexible word. It can easily make things worse. A brief example is I'm a lawyer involved in the judicial review application in Aberdeen in Scotland. There's a community park, St. Felix Park, which I don't know if you know about, but it's zoned for development, ETZ development by Wood Group. And in that application for development, if you look where the funding's coming from, a lot of it's coming from the Just Transition Minister. So in Scotland, we have a Just Transition Minister in the government who has a fund and has released funds that's going to decimate, if this goes ahead, a community park in the working class. Well, there are two main working class areas in Aberdeen, but the most economically deprived area. So it's complete perversion, as some might say it, including the local community, of this notion of just transition. It's completely bound up. So I suppose to weave that into a question, do you see, maybe given those sorts of issues and the ones you pointed to, and John, Professor Barry, do you see particular stress points and opportunities in the just transition where we might be able to kind of mobilize around the sorts of points and themes that you're mentioning and fight for improvements and maybe realize them in this kind of opportunity moment?
I would say, to build off what you said, going with jobs rather than say sort of degrowth or this higher ideology, whatever, because especially when you've had nothing for so long. So in the UK, poverty rates have stayed about the same for the last 30 years. You almost need, I guess, something tangible to show that what you're getting behind is actually going to pay off, because we all want change, but we don't know who effectively are going to be the competent ones to do it. So I really think it is getting behind the things that we can influence first. And there might be small things like, you know, access to better jobs. It might seem very inconsequential, but when you have that power and you're building it and you're getting bigger and bigger. And I know sort of we need to change everything at the top, but I think for some people we need to start like right at square one. So really starting from the underground stuff.
Question.
Yeah, fantastic presentation. I really loved it. Ray spoke about the middle class movements often feeling quite fluffy, and wondering about those, you know, Extinction Rebellion for one example, but also the mainstream left, talk about, or even degrowth as a sort of a theoretical kind of movement. Is it just that the case that they're so concerned with forming the perfect argument that they're just scared to get their hands dirty? And is it the case that strategy is the other thing missing? It's like, how do we actually get to degrowth society, and who are the people you need to bring along? And what are the tactics then you need to employ?
Yeah, but by their own admission, they're like, we don't, our strategy sucks. They actually don't. And then this is something that it's becoming like a really big thing. I personally wouldn't be able to give anyone sort of an idea of degrowth strategy because I guess it's one of these developing things. And in terms of scared to get their hands dirty, yes. And I think in terms of this fluffiness with XR and degrowth, I guess we almost need to think of the starting position that many people have come from. So for the most part, these people have come from quite comfortable middle class backgrounds. So for them actually to go into XR or degrowth is a massive like rebellion. It's very radical. Whereas for working class people, we're like, what the fuck? You know, we come from this gritty area, and I think that always sort of follows on from that. And I think very nice, but I think, yeah, you're right. They are a bit scared to get their hands dirty. But I think sometimes they take this gritty attitude and they misconstrue it as aggression. So I once said to somebody in the degrowth movement, middle class, we need to be brutal with our critique without fear of retribution from any other person. And the individual, and I mean this in the very best way, but they were like, that's a very oppressive word. And I was like, no, it's not. So I think it's really that this overemphasis on conviviality. And I think sometimes you just need to, I don't know what to do. You know what I mean? It's like flip the table.
I've got to bring the meeting to a close, but it does strike me that there is something, it's not just about the degrowth movement, but the left in general. When you move away from representing and acting on the material interests of the working class, when you get politicians and people more concerned that the name of your street is named after a slave owner than the crime or the bad housing on the street, you've lost it. And this has happened right across Europe, where the labour movement and labour politics has become very identitarian. It's all about identity, and it's not actually meeting the material needs of people. But I think Emma has hit the nail on the head in that, as Chico Mendes, who was a murdered Brazilian trade unionist and a rubber tapper, he said, ecology without class politics is gardening. Ecology without class politics is gardening. And in a way, that is part of the invitation I take from Emma. What is a working class climate politics? Which is one of the most pressing questions, because A, it's the working class who are going to suffer the most. They already are suffering. People are already dying, being displaced. The major driver now of climate, refugees and migration is not war or famine or oppression. Sadly, they still are there, but it's actually the climate and ecological crisis. But there is an issue that, representing a class that's the majority in society. The working class are the majority in society. And therefore, they need to be won back in a way through working class movements. We only touched upon, and maybe it's a note for myself about having a follow-up discussion with the local trade union movement. Now, they're an old part of the working class, and where are they in this space and so on? But I do think the reality is that we do need more of these conversations, because it's getting worse. What we're experiencing in these devastating storms, heat waves and so on, and I hate this, and some of my students are in the class, and I hope I don't leave them depressed at the end of the module with me, is that this is not the new normal. For those of us living in this part of the world, we had 3 storms on the back of each other just a few weeks ago. This is an El Nino year. It's going to be even worse in terms of it. So the shit is getting very real. And it has to be about a combination, I think, of, yes, an analysis of who are the people organizing, in whose interest is it to have this? In whose interest is it to have people distracted with consumerism and ads and so on? And it is about them recovering, I think, quite a lot of what has been lost. I think the working class and working class movements are like a muscle that hasn't been exercised in a while. So it's atrophied. And the degrowth movement, I think, as Emma said, needs to come to where the working class is, because they're the majority. It's a bit like my own view, my perpetual frustration with my own colleagues in the academy. What the fuck are we doing? We're the ones who are documenting the eco side of Lough Neagh locally. the ones who are documenting, you know, the ecocidal trajectory of our planet. And yet, why aren't people as angry as I often feel? Why aren't we doing more? So there's something, and I think the academy therefore reflects, to the extent that it gets engaged in this issue, it's the degrowth middle class. Let's write another paper. Now, don't get me wrong, I think colleagues in the room who are younger scholars, you need to do that. But I think, and this is the issue of privilege, I would finish on this, is that professors like me who are well paid and we're coming towards the twilight of our career, we need to be standing up and standing out, bringing the knowledge that we have to working class trade unionists, or another organization we didn't touch upon, only in passing, faith communities. What would Jesus drive? What would Muhammad, bless his name, eat? And so we need to start, I think, spreading out in terms of those movements that should be involved in this conversation. But can I thank Emma for provoking and providing us with such great ideas? I'm sure she'll be more than happy to hang around and talk to people. So can I ask you all to give her a warm welcome?